In the years since his announcement, Rime has gone through a relatively troubled development, with publishers backing out, development hiatuses and the like, but now it's finally out, and man is it gorgeous. The game comes to us from developer Tequila Works, primarily known for their work on the underappreciated Deadlight and the only just released time-manipulating puzzler, The Sexy Brutale. In Rime, you play as a boy who wakes up on the beach of a mysterious island with no rhyme or reason as to how you arrived, and really that's all the setup we need. Part of the charm of this game easily comes from how minimalist it is. You're dropped into the world with no explanation and left to explore the island. Indeed, Rime follows the philosophy of less is more, and this most definitely works in the game's favor, for the most part. There are no walls of text to slow you down, no annoying fairies to point out the blatantly obvious, just you, the beauty of the island, and the unmistakable itch to explore. The world you traverse through is absolutely breathtaking, whimsical, with just a hint of the foreboding. Color oozes out from rocks, trees, and wildlife to an almost exuberant degree, draping the world in eye-catching hues that are truly a sight to behold. Every frame's a painting, as the saying goes, and Rime's world certainly fits this distinction, providing much of the impetus for exploration that goes beyond the search for hidden MacGuffins and Easter eggs and more into the realm of seeking out the most aesthetically pleasing area, if only for the opportunity of drinking in the world's beauty before venturing on to another forgotten glade or hidden beach. This isn't to say that there aren't rewards for exploration, because there are, they just don't really amount to anything once everything is all said and done. Toys and memories scattered about the land hint at a tale beyond that which is being explored by the player, and while ultimately these collectibles only amount to pictures on a screen after the game's completion, they aren't meant to be the driving force for exploration, but rather are secondary to the simple act of soaking in the beauty of this world. This minimalism carries Rime's main quest through to the end, leading the player elegantly through a unique land that doesn't always make logical sense, but never fails to steal one's breath. Like Journey before it, the game is primarily linear, with exploration reserved only for daring to step off the beaten path. Areas are large and sparse with varied scenery, yet this works beautifully within the game's overarching design. The island itself feels as though it was once home to a mighty ancient civilization that disappeared so long ago that only fragments of weather-beaten structures remained, like the kingdom of Ozymandias buried in the sand. And walking through what little remains sparks in the imagination a sense of what could very well be lying just below your feet. From a gameplay perspective, these ruins exist as the primary vehicle to deliver puzzles and climbing sequences, the two primary mechanics of the game. The puzzles themselves are fairly unique takes on those seen in other games of this genre. Moving blocks to hold down switches, traveling down the correct path in a non-Euclidean forest, or hitting a timed switch before rushing to the location and activate it are puzzles seen in hundreds of other games. Ultimately, there isn't anything new on display here, but the way in which Rime presents its own take on these tried and true mechanics is as refreshing as it is complementary to the minimalistic sensibilities of the overall package. The game's other primary mechanic, climbing, is a mechanic that's often overdone in AAA titles like Uncharted and Assassin's Creed, but Rime, as you may have already guessed, is rather restrained in this regard. Make no mistake, there's a lot of climbing to be done, to the point that a good third of the game's 6 hours will be spent hanging by your fingertips, but where Rime differs is in how straightforward these climbing segments are. Other, less restrained titles will often have monolithic climbs in a bid to evoke a sense of vertigo in the player, and will usually have dead ends and breakable handholds to both coax the player along and attempt to keep the adrenaline high, but Rime is more interested in keeping its meandering, solely visual narrative at the forefront of the player's consciousness, to the point that a climb often feels more like an obstacle standing in the way of viewing the beautiful world, as the scenery is suddenly filled with stone walls and rock faces rather than the natural greenery and majestic sea and sky. This urges the player along a set climbing path that typically lasts just long enough to make you pine for the game's glorious whimsy, and then BAM! It returns back to your line of sight, greeting you joyously like an old friend you didn't realize you missed. You might think that only climbing and solving the occasional puzzle in the same environment would get boring after a while, and if the scenery of a specific level overstayed its welcome, you'd be right. Thankfully though, this isn't the case. Rime more or less has 4 distinct levels to it: the outskirts of the island, a desert oasis, a biomechanical forest, and probably the most visually striking downpour level I've ever had the pleasure of roaming about in. Like, damn. Individually, the levels have a very distinct look and color palette, making each feel separate from, but thematically linked to one another. The beach utilizes as many colors as possible, the desert area focuses on yellows, oranges, and reds, the forest and ancient ruins feature greens, light blues, and off-whites, and the downpour level plays with blacks, grays, and dark blues. And at least for me, I found myself moving from one area to another just as the scenery started to lose its magic. So much detail and love has gone into this unique world that it almost becomes a character in and of itself, but thankfully, the world isn't the only compelling character. Ultimately, there are only 3 characters in the game: the nameless boy you play as, a fennec fox that acts as your guide, and a mysterious figure in a red cloak. There's no dialogue to be found within Rime, save for a faux language and various noises made by our protagonist, though even without speaking, you always know exactly what he's thinking or feeling, and the way in which he communicates is very reminiscent of Link from the Wind Waker. His facial expressions and mannerisms change to suit the tone of the story, he takes time to have fun, and exudes a general can-do attitude, which makes it all the more impactful when things take a serious turn in the third act of the story. The red cloaked figure seemingly watches you from from the sidelines, acting as both a guiding marker as well as a vehicle to inject a bit more mystery into the world. And while ultimately the conclusion of this character's role in the story falls a little flat toward the end, his presence in the early moments of the game is spot on. Then there's the fox that acts as your waypoint and companion throughout your journey. To begin with, the linear design of the main path of the game isn't clearly marked by the scenery, and because your guiding post of a large tower off in the distance isn't always visible from every location, there are instances in which you can lose your bearings if you aren't careful. However, our little foxy friend minimizes this problem by always leading the player in the right direction, leaving behind a trail of multicolored leaves as it darts around corners, making sure you always know in which direction he ran off. And without spoiling anything, let's just say there's a decent reveal of the fox's true role in the story, which provides a nice bookend for the first and final moments of the game. So now you're probably wondering if there's anything that I don't like about the game. Well, there are a few issues that I take that prevent Rime from being a true masterpiece, though they definitely aren't game-breaking. Firstly is the game's performance. There's no way around it. This game needs some work in terms of optimization. My Steam copy of the game suffered from constant dips in frame rate and stuttering at first, but seeing as this is a known issue that's actively being worked on by the developer, I'm not going to dock the game any points because this complaint will most likely be rendered moot the instant a patch rolls out. I did follow the developer's recommended settings for my graphics card and it seemed to help with the stuttering, but I still noticed large areas of the game remained locked at 30 FPS while smaller areas ran at a smooth 60. Either way, the performance issues and bugs aren't game-breaking, but they are something to keep in mind for early adopters. However, my biggest issue with the game is that it becomes progressively shallower as you approach the climax, at least from a gameplay perspective. What I mean by this is that in the first section of the game, there's a lot of room for exploration enveloping the linear main route. This works in the game's favor because, as previously stated, scratching the itch of exploration becomes the reward for the exploration, but as the game progresses, the areas surrounding the main path become narrower and narrower until you're eventually limited to a single walkway, feeling as though you're being led by the nose on an increasingly vapid sightseeing tour. When the game begins, the world is open, the desire for exploration is great, and you have the freedom to stray from the set path, but eventually you're going to be restrained to a single route. This would be fine if the developers used the more limited design of the penultimate moments of the game to introduce new puzzles and challenges, but the sparsity found in the beginning of the game, which only worked within the context of a desire for exploration, is maintained until the final act, causing the world to become progressively less enjoyable until it's nearly as dull as walking simulators along the lines of games like Dear Esther. Visually, the game never fails to impress. Narratively, it's flawed but still intriguing, but from a purely mechanical lens, it gradually loses its punch until the gameplay is paper thin. However, I don't think this is necessarily a deal breaker, as the majority of the game is still fantastic, and I can see what the developers are trying to accomplish from a narrative standpoint. They just didn't hit the mark as close as they could have. Overall, Rime is still a great game that I'll gladly attach my personal recommendation to, if for no other reason than for you to experience its breathtaking world. While it doesn't quite measure up to masterpieces like Ico and Journey, it does have some unique ideas and does an above-average job at telling a story through a solely visual manner, certainly making it worth your time, especially if you're a fan of this type of game.